Amen. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you for all that you do in education and helping our students become all that they can be. So that's the Army, but we'll make it education as well. Anyway, we are continuing our study in the life of Paul. We're at Acts chapter 18. We're going to finish up Acts chapter 18 today. And then we're going to take a break for a couple of weeks because we're going to go in and look at a couple of letters that Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica. This is we're going to try to stop along the way as Paul wrote these letters. He actually wrote them from Corinth, and we're leaving Corinth today, but we're going to kind of back up and look at those letters, and then we'll get back into Acts as we continue. But before we get started today, I like to ask questions to frame where we're going. So let me ask this question. Do you ever wonder if after you're gone, you're going to leave a legacy? Do you ever wonder if what you're doing in your life matters so much that it's going to extend beyond you? That you want to do something that matters so much it's going to make a difference in the future. In 1889, there was a group of believers who decided to start a church. They started that church in 1889, and they met at a schoolhouse about a mile north of here. It was on the northwest corner of 104th and Portland in a schoolhouse. And then that church became Antioch Christian Church. And then that church over the years grew and moved to this location on this land with other buildings that were here. One burned down, and then they became this church. And for 127 years, a church named Antioch Christian Church met either there or here. And then in 2016, we came together, and Summit Church came to us, and Antioch Christian Church became part of Summit Church because we believed that we would be better together, right? Now, I will tell you that through those months of the transition, there was a lot of people who said a lot of things to me. There's a lot of people who said things like, well, you're shaming the history. You're ignoring the history of this church. I even had one guy come up to me at my aunt's funeral. I'm sitting there with the family, and he sits down next to me. He said, what was wrong with Antioch that you couldn't keep the doors open? At my aunt's funeral. I was like, well, I didn't answer. Luckily, my wife didn't hear what he said. But anyway, there was this idea that somehow we were we were ignoring or shaming the history. I saw it differently. You know what I saw? I saw a church that now was standing on the shoulders of people who had come before. Just like in reality, there were no original members in the church at the time, just so you know. 127 years, there was nobody still there, right? So all of us had been standing on the shoulders of the people before us. I saw it as this opportunity to pass the baton or pass the torch to another generation. And it's incredible to think about what God has done and He continues to do. We, a few years later, went down to Norman to another church, University Christian Church, and the same thing happened. And again, where we were told that we were ignoring the history or closing the doors of a church, it's like, no, we're continuing on the ministry that started many, many, many years ago. Because for churches to succeed and for churches to continue on, there has to be a passing of the baton over and over and over again. And so for a legacy to happen, there has to be a passing of the baton. Back in Jewish days, rabbis would gather, they would have disciples underneath them. Okay? And here's what it would look like. A rabbi would have however many disciples he had. And what they would do is they would follow him. They would learn from him. They would spend time with him. Sometimes they would live with him. And what they would do, he had 3 things that a rabbi would tell his disciples they needed to do. And these are good. One is, you need to do what I do. Look at me, see what I'm doing, do what I do. The second thing he would tell them is, you need to teach what I'm teaching you. So you need to find other people and you need to teach them the things that I'm teaching you. And then the third thing a rabbi would tell his disciples is, you need to be me when I'm not around. You need to be me whenever I'm absent. So teach what I teach, do what I do, be me when I am absent. And I think somewhere along the way in America, we have lost this. Somewhere along the way, we have transferred, and you've heard me talk about this over the last few weeks, so you're going to be like, we've heard this, Nathan. we have somehow transferred all of that work to one person or to a staff of people who are paid to do it. Instead of recognizing that if we want to impact the world for Christ, the church in America has to wake up where everybody becomes the priesthood of all believers, and every one of us is multiplying ourselves in a way that makes a difference. And that's what I believe Paul's mission was. Look at verse 18 and let's see what Paul was doing. He did something very incredible here. After staying for some time in Corinth, that's where Paul is, Paul said farewell to the brothers and sisters and sailed away to Syria. We'll get to that in just a minute. He was accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. I'm not going to make a big point here, but once again, Luke puts the woman in a prominent position. It was unheard of to say the woman's name before the man's name. Women in ministry were very, very important to Luke, it seems like. Paul shaved his head at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. When they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and debated with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he declined, but he said farewell and added, I'll come back to you again if God wills. And then he set sail from Ephesus. Let's show the map. We're coming to the end of Paul's second missionary journey. And on this map, he's crossed Asia Minor. He's come all the way across Asia Minor, the Galatia area. He revisited the churches in Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Then he goes across to Egypt, or not Egypt. Why did I say Egypt? He goes across to Macedonia and Greece, which is Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth. And he's establishing these faith communities there. And now he is leaving to go back to Syria, which is all the way over there to the right. Jerusalem is south of there, and then he's going to Antioch, which is the church that sent him out. Now, what is Cenchrea? Let me stop for just a minute. We talked a couple weeks ago about this little land bridge between Achaia and Corinth, okay? And so northern and southern Greece. And Corinth controlled this. There was a harbor on either side. Cenchrea was the harbor on the Aegean Sea side. And so on the right side. So that's where he left from. And he had taken this vow. And so he cut his hair at that point. So a lot of people think this was a Nazirite vow. Some people think it wasn't. Let me explain what that is. A Nazirite vow was a period of time that a Jew would say, I'm going to be committed, devoted to the Lord. I'm committing this time to him. It was at least a month or 3 months. It had to be a pretty significant amount of time, and they would devote themselves to abstain from 3 things. They would not take anything from any grapes or wine. They would not cut their hair, and they would not be in the room or touch a dead body. Those are the things they do, but it was a way to say, God, I'm with you, I'm loyal to you, I'm going to commit my life to you for this season. Not that they did in other times, but it was a special dedication. Now, at the end of that dedication, or the end of that vow, they say, I'm going to do this for 3 months. Then they would shave their head, and they would take the hair of their head, and they would go to the temple or the tabernacle, and they would burn the hair as a sacrifice to God. So some people think this wasn't a thing for Paul. It wasn't a Nazirite vow because he wasn't at Jerusalem. But I'm going to speculate for just a minute. Maybe that's why he went to Jerusalem. I mean, I just picture him shaving his head, putting it in a pouch, and taking the hair with him so he can make the sacrifice. I don't know if that's what happened. That's just the way my brain thinks. But anyway, so he made this vow. He goes to Jerusalem, or he goes to Ephesus before he goes to Jerusalem. And he does something interesting here. He doesn't stay. All of this time, Paul has been going from town to town, establishing churches, faith communities, and he stays for as long as he can, and he establishes them, and then he moves on. Now, a lot of people, I think, I used to read it this way. You say, well, he was at this church, and then he got called away to a different church, kind of like youth ministers, about every 18 months is about the average for a lot of them, right? So it's like he's just moving from church to church. That's not really what's going on here. Paul was committed to these places, and he knew that they all needed to be sustained. And hear me, he knew that he couldn't do it by himself. So what did he do? He's got these guys, Priscilla and Aquila, this couple that he's been doing life together with, and he spent 18 months in Corinth with them, establishing and growing this faith community in Corinth, the church in Corinth. And now he takes them to Ephesus. He does a little bit because he can't avoid going to the synagogue, right? That seems to be Paul's MO. Every time he goes into town, he goes. But then they say, can you stay? And he goes, nope. I'll be back at some point if God lets me. And it says he left Priscilla and Aquila there. I want you to notice something. Paul had equipped them, and now he was empowering them to be in charge of this faith community. Now, we'll get to Ephesus in a few weeks, okay? Ephesus was very significant. The city itself was significant. The church in Ephesus was significant. Paul will spend the majority of his third missionary journey. We're going to be in Ephesus a lot when we move on into his third missionary journey. But he was committed to and devoted to these people so much that he had equipped and empowered people. Why? Hear me. Because he couldn't do it all by himself. And somehow in America, and somehow even in all of the Western culture, we have taken church and turned it into exactly the opposite of what Paul was doing. We have turned it into this place where we hire people to do that. You've heard this from me, right? We hire people to do all the work, and therefore we can just sit here and it ends with me. You teach me, and I might do what you do, and I might teach what you teach, but I will never be you in your absence. Because that's your job, right? And that's what it looks like. Paul had spent all this time training them and equipping them to be who God wanted them to be, so that they could continue to engage people. It was multiplication versus addition. Now, a lot of you have seen this before and you've heard this before, but it was multiplication versus addition. It was he knew that he couldn't do it on his own, and this is true in math and it's true in church growth. Multiplication is exponentially better than addition, right? So let me show you this graph, the difference between multiplication and addition. Now it says a month or a year. We're going to say a year because we don't like ribs that are made in the microwave. We like them made in the crock pot, right? So we're going to say, let me ask you a question. If in 1 year, Summit Church grew by, you had 30 people come to faith in Jesus because of our ministry, would that be a good year? Would we celebrate that? Would that be amazing? Yeah. And we'd probably go, man, if he does it again in year 2, we need to lock that guy down, right? That guy's doing a good job if he's adding people to the ministry, right? And so we have people put in their faith. So year 2, you have 60. You go 30 to 60 to 90, right? Here's the thing. By addition, if you go all the way out to 30 years on the right, in 30 years, if 900 people came to know Jesus because of our ministry, would we celebrate that? Yes. But let me show you something different. And you can see these numbers, but I want to go to the next chart because I want you to imagine with me this. What if if I went out and I led one person to Christ? What if I led one person to Christ and it took me a year to do it? And then next year, myself and the person I led to Christ went out and led people to Christ. So then in year 2, we got four new converts. Yeah, might need some work, right? That's what we'd be thinking. But then in year 4, we have 16 if it keeps multiplying. And you get all the way down to 33 years. And if we continue to do that, 8 billion people will be reached. Do you see how multiplication is much better than addition? But we've been content with allowing addition to be how we do things. Let's go on. Let's go to the next layer. Verse 22. On landing at Caesarea, Paul, went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. Let me stop for just a minute. If you looked on the map, you saw Antioch was up here and Jerusalem was here. How could he go up to Jerusalem and down, right? Well, Jerusalem was on a hill, and it was very common language. When you said, I'm going to Jerusalem, you're going up to Jerusalem. It was Zion. It was a very holy place, right? And when you're leaving, you're going down from Jerusalem. So that's very, very common. Not weird that he said that. What happened here? He went to Jerusalem. I don't know if he burned his hair. I don't know what was going on. All I know is he went to Jerusalem, and then he visited the church there, and then he went up to the place that had sent him out, Antioch in Syria, and he visited, and he stayed there for a while. And then Luke does something crazy. I want you to notice this. This is the end of the second journey, the beginning of the third. Okay? Pretty wild how matter-of-factly he does this. After spending some time there, he set out, traveling through one place after another in the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Just like that. He ended one, he stayed there for a while, and then he went on and traveled. I have the next journey, the next map to show you. This is where we're going to be for the next few weeks. So he took off and he went across back again, right? He hadn't given up on those churches. They were still his churches. He just wasn't the main pastor. He had other people who were leading them. He's going to encourage them. He visits them and he takes off. And matter of factly, Luke just says, here we begin the third journey. Verse 24. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native Alexandrian, an eloquent man who was competent in the use of the Scriptures, arrived in Ephesus. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord and been fervent in the Spirit. He was speaking and teaching accurately about Jesus, although he knew only of John's baptism. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and after Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. When he wanted to cross over to Achaia, that's Corinth, by the way, the brothers and sisters wrote to the disciples to welcome him. So the faith community that had been established in Ephesus writes to the faith community that was established in Corinth and said, hey, you need to welcome this guy. After he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, the believers there. For he vigorously refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating through the Scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. So here's the next layer. Paul had poured into, equipped, and empowered Priscilla and Aquila to establish his faith community in Ephesus. This guy who was from Alexandria, who's Apollos? He's from Alexandria. Alexandria was a city in Egypt, and it was a place where a lot of Christians had come out of. There was a vibrant community, a vibrant number of people making disciples there, and he had come from that. He was very competent in the Scriptures. He knew it. He knew the Hebrew Scriptures well. He was very eloquent in the way he spoke. He was educated. He'd been instructed. We don't know who discipled him, but somebody did, right? He was fervent, energetic in the Spirit. He was accurate and bold in his teaching. Now, it says he knew about Jesus, but he only knew of John's baptism. And so John's baptism was a baptism for repentance only. And John himself, you remember John the Baptist said, well, there's one coming after me who will baptize with the Spirit. And so there was more to it. And so what happened? He's teaching one day. He's very eloquent. Everyone likes hearing him talk. He's great. And Priscilla and Aquila hear something, maybe this John's baptism thing. And so they bring him aside and they begin to pour into him. Now, the word for they tried to help him know more accurately, the word Luke uses here has this idea of great care. Here's what it means. I don't think Priscilla and Aquila brought Apollos in and go, man, you're just wrong. I mean, I can't believe you don't know the Bible better than that. No, they brought him in and they said, hey, let me explain to you more. And so they brought him in under their wing. They nurtured him. They did ministry with him. They discipled him, right? And then he wants to go over to Achaia, over to Corinth. So he goes over to Corinth. And when he gets over there, he's a great help. And what's he do? He goes in the synagogue. Sound familiar? And he begins to teach them that Jesus is the Messiah. Sound familiar? And they begin to oppose him. Sound familiar? Who does Apollos look like? He looks a lot like Paul, doesn't he? Let me remind you of something. Paul and Apollos have never met at this point. Paul and Apollos have never met at this point, and now you see how the layers work, how the multiplying of disciple making works. Because Paul poured into Priscilla and Aquila, he equipped them, he trained them, and he empowered them, he released them to go and do ministry. And then Aquila and Priscilla did the same thing to Apollos. They equipped him, they trained him, they walked with him, they lived with him. And then they empowered him by sending him to Corinth to do ministry. Apollos became very, very significant in Corinth. In fact, if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, you might have heard this before where the people were arguing over who they followed, remember? And Paul said, well, some of you say I follow Paul, and some of you say I follow Apollos. In some ways, Apollos became, I'm not going to say he was equal with Paul, but he became very, very significant to that church. And he never even met him yet. Isn't that incredible? I want you to see Paul's spiritual tree. See, Paul spent time pouring into some specific people. He poured into Timothy. He poured into Priscilla and Aquila. He poured into Titus. He poured into Silas and a few others. If you go back to Jesus, Jesus poured into 12, you remember? And then he poured into 3, and he poured into them. And if Paul had been so driven that he had to be the one that led every person to Christ, less people would have been led to Christ, but he understood the value of multiplication. And so he poured into Timothy, and then he poured into Priscilla and Aquila, and they poured into Apollos, who poured into somebody else, who poured into somebody else. So what does your spiritual tree look like? I'm assuming you're here today because someone poured into you. Someone share the gospel with you. Someone engage you. So think about who those people are in your tree, right? Here's the bigger question. Who's downstream from you? Who's in the chain beyond you? I'm going to say it again. If the church becomes the place where someone pours into you and it stops with you, not only are we not living out the mission of Christ, we will not have the impact that God ever intended for us to have in the world. And if you wonder why the church is not having that impact, maybe that's the reason. For decades, for generations, we have been lazy in our discipleship making because we've been content receiving instead of realizing we have to give. Let me show it to you from a secular physical standpoint. There was a coach at Iowa University, the Iowa Hawkeyes. His name was Hayden Fry. Hayden Fry has a coaching tree. I want you to see some of the names on this coaching tree. You might be able to read them, you might not. You might recognize some. Bill Snyder, Barry Alvarez, Brett Bielema, Dan McCarney. You can jump over, you might recognize this name, Bob Stoops, Mike Stoops, Mark Stoops, Jimbo Fisher, Nick Saban. You ever heard of these guys? Urban Meyer. I'm not talking about their moral character, okay? But these guys are some good coaches, right? And they all came from this one coaching tree in one way or another. Some of those guys never met Hayden Fry. Yet they have impacted college football in an incredible way because he poured into some, who poured into some, who poured into others, who poured into others, and eventually you have all these people who are coaching football and making an impact on the game because of this one man. So again, what does your discipleship tree look like? Who's upstream? Who's downstream? My grandparents lived a long ways away from me, and so I didn't get to I maybe spent 1 week out of the year seeing my grandparents, if that. But man, they impacted my life. I've got uncles and cousins who are incredible gospel winners, and they have impacted my life even though I've spent more time with you guys than I have with them. My children never met my dad. My wife never met my dad. Yet I pray to God that they have been impacted by the ministry of my dad because of me. I have met some of my grandchildren. I may not get to meet them all. I probably won't get to meet my great-grandchildren, definitely not my great-great-grandchildren. But I pray to God. I pray to God that they are influenced by me because of what I've done pouring into the people who are downstream, down the chain from me. As the band comes back up, I guess the last question we have to answer is, how do you do this? How do you engage? How do you equip? How do you empower? The Bible tells us, Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 4, a letter he wrote back to that church in Ephesus, right? He tells us that God gave some to be pastors, teachers, right? To equip God's people for works of service. I understand that seems like it's for the people who are on the paid staff. I want you to hear me. If you have not heard anything over the last few weeks, I want you to hear this. It is not just them. God has put each of us in a role to at least be a teacher to someone. I don't care how old you are in this room. There is someone downstream from you who needs you to engage them. Look what it looks like. So Christ gave himself Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. And then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Here's the empowering part. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Engage, equip, empower, repeat. Engage, equip, empower, repeat. What's it look like? You need to be engaging people in your life who don't know Jesus and calling them to faith in Jesus and calling them on mission. There are people in your life who don't know Jesus. Don't tell me they're not. If they're not, you better go find them. Because there's people who you're acquainted with, people who you will encounter. You need to engage them. Then you need to do something more. You need to walk with them. You need to encourage them in spiritual growth. You need to learn from them how you can grow more spiritually, right? Cultivate this spiritual growth in them. Help them discover their shape, how God has wired them, their spiritual gifts, their heart, their passion. Where should they be serving? After they put their faith in Jesus, help them become multiplying disciple makers, right? So helping them, walking with them, it's not a one-shot deal. You got to keep coming back to Galatia, right? You got to keep coming back like Paul did. Create ministry opportunities for them. Help them. Say, okay, come do this with me. Let me show you how to do it. All right, let's go do it, and you do it this time. I'll watch you. Now I'm going to empower you, and I'm going to let you go. I'm going to release you to do ministry. Support and encourage them. Pray with them. Pray for them. Lead by example. Engage. Equip. Empower. Repeat. For the rest of our lives. Let me see if I can illustrate how this works from a story from history. There was a guy named Dwight L. Moody. Dwight L. Moody is known for being an incredible evangelist during the 19th century and for starting Moody Bible Institute. When he was a kid, he didn't even want to go to church. He wanted nothing to do with God. He wanted nothing to do with religion or with church, but he was forced to go. He was forced to go. And while he was there in Sunday school, he had a Sunday school teacher named Edward Kimball. And Edward Kimball built a relationship with him. And over the years, he poured into him. And because of Edward Kimball, Dwight L. Moody put his faith in Jesus and became one of the most renowned speakers of the gospel all over the place, right? In fact, listen to this. This blew my mind. I don't know if it's true. The internet said it, so it has to be right now. I don't know if it's true or not. It is estimated that Dwight Moody preached to over 100 million people the gospel of Jesus Christ. This was not during the age of social media. This was not even during the age of television. In front of people, face to face, over the life of his ministry, he preached to over 100 million people the gospel message of Jesus. Is that a good story? We can end it right there, right? But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. Because Dwight Moody impacted a man named J. Wilbur Chapman, who in turn influenced a guy named Billy Sunday to come to faith in Jesus. And through his revivals, Billy Sunday then led a man named Mordecai Ham to Jesus. And Mordecai Ham was leading a revival in North Carolina. And there was a young teenage boy that was in the crowd that day. And as he shared the gospel message, this young teenage boy gave his life to Jesus Christ. And I don't think there's anyone in this room that would say that Billy Graham has not had an impact on the gospel in America and in the world. But if it had stopped with Dwight L. Moody, we wouldn't have Billy Graham. If it had stopped anywhere along that tree, we wouldn't have Billy Graham. And so the challenge for you and me today is each one reach one. Each one reach one. Who is it that you need to reach? And then when you reach that one, repeat. Engage, equip, empower, repeat. Engage, equip, empower, repeat. Because you don't know who's going to be sitting in a revival meeting or in a church service years from now that will come to know Jesus because you were willing to engage and equip, empower, repeat. Guys, I want to challenge you today as we sing. We're going to have communion on the sides of the room. We'll have prayer team members. I'm going to ask you to respond. I'm going to ask you, who is that? You can lift this up to God. You can come forward and you can pray with someone, and I want you to give them a name. I want you to say, who is it? Who is it that God has put in your life that you need to engage and equip and empower so the gospel message can continue? Who's it going to be? Let's stand. Let's worship Him.